Mr. Noam Chomsky. He is a world-renowned linguist, MIT professor, critic of U.S. foreign policy, theorist of democracy. All power to the people. Please give it up for Mr. Noam Chomsky.
I don't know about you, but I always find it kind of intimidating to be up here, as if I should say something profound and extremely meaningful and way beyond me. But I'll talk for a couple minutes about what we were asked to talk about, the election. There are two good things about Tuesday, in my opinion. One is that the worst didn't happen, and the second is came close, and the second is that it's over. And that means, for one thing, we can stop getting annoying phone calls, but more significantly, it means that activists can go back to what they should always be doing. As far as the election's concerned, the right attitude towards it, in my opinion, was to take about 5 minutes to think about what to do and then forget about it and go back to what has to be done. And what has to be done is you all know, is to work to change the conditions that allow extravaganzas like this to go on. And insofar as there are elections, make them meaningful, but meanwhile change the society so that it really does work for the people, as we just heard. That's a big task. Now, there are a couple interesting observations about the election. Some have been discussed, some not much. There were, I think, some good things. So personally, at least, I'm glad that Elizabeth Warren got in. I think that could be very helpful. There were also some unpleasant things. One of them, which didn't get a lot of publicity, is a referendum in Michigan, which was voted down overwhelmingly. It was a referendum guaranteeing the right of collective bargaining, that is, guaranteeing the right of workers to organize. That's the fact that was defeated, and defeated substantially, is kind of an illustration of the work people like us have to do. It's a reflection of the extreme effectiveness of the huge propaganda campaign against working people that's been going on for a long time, but has really peaked substantially in the last couple of years. It's basically bipartisan. And it's reached the working class substantially, which is a very dangerous phenomenon. And that goes to something else that is barely discussed. And one of the most important things about the election, I think, is what didn't happen. What didn't happen is that almost half the population didn't even bother to vote. Now, if you look at the correlation between voting and income, you find it's extremely close. So what that means is that roughly the lower half of the income level didn't bother to vote. Those people have been carefully studied. Their attitudes are social democratic. If they were to vote overwhelmingly, they would vote Democratic by probably a factor of maybe 3 to 1 or something like that. And their votes, if they did affect policy, would change the country significantly. So the question is why they didn't vote. Well, a lot of possible reasons. One reason is just that the contemporary version of the old poll tax, which goes back to the Constitution, was enough to inhibit lots of people without resources from voting. You read about all the efforts that have been made by the Republican Party to prevent voting for quite good reasons when they know who they're going to vote for. So that surely had some kind of an effect. But my guess is that a bigger effect came from something that people intuitively understand, even if they don't know the data. Topics have been quite well studied in academic political science, and with a lot of work on public attitudes and public policy and the relation between them. And it turns out that about 70% of the population, the lower 70% on the income level, have no influence at all on policy. So it doesn't matter what they think. So they're effectively disenfranchised. And if you move up the income wealth level, you get more influence on policy. And when you get to the very top, the 1% in the imagery of the Occupy movement, more accurately, the 1/10 of 1%, where the real concentration of wealth is, they essentially get what they want. Even if people haven't read the academic studies, I think they know in their bones. And I presume that that's a major reason why almost half the population doesn't even try to participate, knowing that it's not going to make any difference what they think anyway. Well, that's another major task that has to be addressed. They're not wrong, incidentally, but we have to change the conditions in which they're right, and that's no small task. Something else that must have been obvious to everyone who bothered to look at the newspapers Wednesday morning was the maps. Had to strike everyone who looked at them that this is the Civil War. The red states are the South, the blue states are the North. The West wasn't around then, so we can cut that out. I mean, it was around, it just hadn't been conquered yet. In fact, it had just been conquered from Mexico, but it was not really integrated into the society yet. And that's pretty significant. One of the reasons the U.S. is somewhat different from other industrial democracies in a number of ways. One way is it has never barely had class-based parties. It's had sectional parties. And that starts right after the Civil War. The slogan was, you vote where you shoot, So people who were on one side voted one way, that was Democratic in those days. People on the other side voted the other way, it was Republican. Now, it's not 100%. So in the North, the Catholic working class voted Democratic, but they didn't have much influence on the Democratic Party, in fact, practically none. They were in kind of Tammany-type situations, ethnic local policies run by Irish politicians or something else who cared for their immediate interests, but the parties, in fact, both the parties, quite quickly fell into the hands of wealthy manufacturers and financial interests. They were somewhat different, and incidentally, they remain somewhat. The names have changed, but the division remains. So in the 1960s, with the civil rights legislation and Nixon's Southern strategy, so-called, the names changed. So the old Democratic Party became the Republican Party, and the old Republican Party was substantially renamed Democratic Party. Again, it's never been exact. It wasn't then, it's not now. One other thing that happened since the 1960s, and you all know it, is that there's been an enormous rise of racism, extreme racism. And it shows up in the demography of the voting. So it was, as you know, I'm sure it was to a very substantial extent, it was a white versus non-white vote. You can tell it in the statistics. Not 100%, but substantially, and in fact much more than before, which is not a good thing for the country. Furthermore, you see it in other ways. If you look closely at polling results, at public attitudes, there's a lot of evidence that the racism is deep, and it's based on, a lot of it's based on fear. Fear which is sometimes articulated that they're taking our country away from us. They being, you know who. We, the whites, especially the white Protestants, we're losing our country. We're becoming a minority. And people know that, and they're terrified. It shows up, the hatred of Obama goes way beyond any rational explanation. It's amazing when you look at it. So half of Republicans think that he intends to impose Islamic Sharia law, not on just the United States, but on the entire world. About 25% of Republicans think he might be Antichrist. 40% of Americans, all Americans, think he wasn't born in the United States. Now that means practically all Republicans think that, yeah. Well, you know, these are divides that raise very serious problems. It's interesting to study how it happened. I'll just end by saying that throughout modern history, it's severely undermined the possibility to develop an organized militant working class. A couple of exceptions, like CIO organizing in the 30s, Knights of Labor in the late 19th century, but it's pretty standard. It's a very bad now. Unless there is an organized militant labor movement, it's very unlikely that the goals of changing the society will be achieved. And that's a major task in itself.
It's my pleasure next to introduce Vijay Prashad, an activist, scholar, and author of 15 books, including The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. Please join me in welcoming Vijay Prashad.
Thank you, Soren, for inviting me. Unlike Noam, who uses a virtual teleprompter, I brought some pieces of paper. Scattered are the lunatics, like rats, scurrying across the floor in panic when the lights are turned up. For 40 years, they have assumed that the cultural world of the United States is to their advantage. Hatred of the outsider and of women distinguished their social view. Theirs is the rhetoric of freedom and liberty, papering over very lightly a politics of suffocation. The main word was no. No to this, no to that. No to a woman's right to dignity, no to the unfurling of the full personality of the outsider. No to the social wage, public transport, public schools, public health care, public welfare, and of course, no to getting high. This election revealed that beneath the votes for this or that political party lies a social landscape that seeks real freedom. The votes for gay marriage and for medical and recreational marijuana tell us that the days of the preacher's aura in the polling booth are soon to be over. The lunatics are in disarray. To quote, of all people, Alec Baldwin, it is a bad thing for a political party when you ask, did the rape guy lose? And the answer is, which one? Buntings of blue have emerged in the southern districts of Texas, leaking into the bastion of republicanism. By 2034, the United States will be a majority-minority country. There it is. The lunatics are unprepared for this transformation. They are addicted to racism and misogyny. There is no 12-step program for their recovery. They are too far gone, undone by their habits of fear, hatred, and arrogance. The fraternity runs the campus, society as Animal House. What of the winners? Certainly they are not social cretins. They do not flinch when talking of sex and women or of race and the outsider. They do not look at every woman and assume that she is a vessel for their contentment, or at every outsider and think that they are either to be deported or jailed. That is their temperamental advantage. They win by default, by the habits of a two-party system. It used to be said that the Democrats are the lesser evil. If the political world can be seen as a kaleidoscope with 3 bits of glass inside, one of those bits that reflects in the mirror confirms the Democrats' progressive advantage. That is the glass that says on it, women and outsiders. But the 2 other pieces of glass on finance and war are interchangeable between the 2 parties. There is no lesser evil here. Only, as the Black Agenda report's Glenn Ford put it, the more effective evil. Because the party of lunacy makes gestures that turn off the majority of the country, it is harder for them to actually disembowel the entitlement programs, to drain the tank of Social Security and Medicare, to break the back of union power. If the Democrats do it, liberalism sniffs and moans, but then acknowledges that this is perhaps inevitable, that the times require responsibility. The shadow of Bill Clinton's evisceration of liberalism hangs heavy on the Obama presidency. Grand bargains, balanced budget amendments, deep cuts to the tune of $2.50 for every dollar in spending. This is the economics of finance capital, and it says nothing to the global job situation. The parties of Wall Street, both of them, say nothing to the millions of disposable people who will never be able to find meaningful employment in this dispensation. A society dominated by finance capital suffers from acute joblessness. Money is made through mathematical manipulation, not through trade in goods and services between real, living people, all of whom have irritating things like desires and wants, encumbrances to the world of finance. No cuts to the military, no let-up on war. A few hours after the election, drones struck in Yemen near Sana'a, killing at least 3 people. A finger in the eye of the United Nations, whose bureaucrats have slowly begun another investigation into drone attacks. The habits of belligerence are so ingrained that at the 3rd presidential debate, neither candidate inhaled reality and exhaled the truth. Obama said that Romney was speaking as if he was in the 1980s, with Russia as the main threat. The fact is that both seem to be stuck in that fateful decade, shrouded by the fog of American supremacy. More ships, with bayonets or not, more troops, more bombings. Even when they say they want more diplomacy, what they mean is the strangulation of countries, embargoes of Cuba and Iran, harsh economic warfare that does not build the confidence between nations. China and Iran are set to change their leaders. China now, Iran next year. But neither candidate reached out to the new governments, eager for a new relationship. Theirs was the framework of pro-Israel, anti-Iran, pro-machismo, anti-negotiation, pro-1980s, anti-21st century. So where does this leave us? Some confidence in the fact that the social landscape favors the politics of the future. Great tasks manifest ahead to move the landscape away from the parties of war and Wall Street. Base-building organizations across the country are alive to the possibility of a more systematic assertion in the political domain. What fails us consistently is a much shriveled historical imagination. We fear the lunatics and run for shelter, inconsistent with our own self-awareness that their roof is rickety. The tasks of an expanded political imagination are already available. There are the little things, the passage of the Employee Free Choice Act, which would build up the enclaves of organized labor, an increase in the minimum wage, an allowance for bankruptcy judges to write down mortgage debt so you can end finally the foreclosure epidemic. Then the big things, revitalization of the public sphere and an increase in public goods, transport, schools, housing, not only for their usefulness, but because these would allow a serialized, privatized population to get a sniff of social solidarity, to give us a cultural preview of a socialist communitarian world. If we relied upon each other and saw each other more, we'd build trust in our capacity to shape this world. That was the lesson of the Occupy movement, and it endures. But not this, not social democracy, not that, planetary humility. The IMF forecasts that by 2016, China will be the world's most powerful economy. That date is within reach. But the US political class has denied its importance to the population. When empires collapse, they prefer to go to war rather than to allow a peaceful transition. World War II heralded the collapse of the British Raj, just as the Napoleonic Wars led to the usurpation of Holland's preeminent position. Empires stubbornly try to hold on, unwilling to read the tea leaves. The finance capitalists are the canaries, hastening from the old center of empire to the new, fleeing Amsterdam for London in the 18th century, and then from London to New York in the last one, and now from New York draining investment capital into the Pacific Rim and other emergent centers. In the 1920s, the old war dog Winston Churchill moaned, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." Too late. Money had already fled, and the deindustrialization of Britain left Manchester and Sheffield as heritage towns and not the powerhouses they once were. The anatomy of imperial decline of old contains the anatomy of the decline of the American empire and of the American dream. Detroit, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, Solvay, New York, shadows of what they once were, ghosts of industrial might. Belligerent talk backed up by the menace of aerial bombardment threatens a planet that does not seem to have the appetite for another superpower. The Chinese are content with multipolarity, since their entire foreign policy seems to be driven by the Treaty of Westphalia. You do your thing, we'll do ours. This is a historical opening for the planet, with regionalism allowing for the emergence of new kinds of solutions, whether in Latin America, with their own trading agreements and their own political platforms, or in Southwest Asia, with India, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, creating a new Southern Silk Road. The Southern Silk Road is an important development in the creation of regionalism, linking South Asia to Central Asia and West Asia to China. No longer will these regions go through the US and European-dominated routes to conduct their trade. As a result of the growth of regionalism, US primacy and its unipolar approach is being set aside. The deepening links with Iran are a testament to the lack of US domination in the region and of its political failure to isolate Iran. Americanism is a false utopia. Regionalism is today's reality. It's too bad we're so left out of understanding what's happening in our own world. Thank you very much.
Little bit of food for thought. So the next person we have coming to stage is Sam Christiansen. Studies South Asian and world history with strong interest in social movements. She's the co-editor of The Third World in Global 1960s. Please give it up for Sam Christiansen.
Great. Thanks. I have to say, this is very much my first time speaking from a pulpit, so this is kind of a personal moment for me, I think. I think I'm going to take a slightly different track from my friends today, and part of the reason for this is when it comes to the international policy, I think that fellow worker Chomsky and Dr. Prashad are more qualified than I am to make these commentaries. But I'm really here as a historian of social movements, but more importantly, I'm here as an activist. And I'm here asking really the same question that you're all asking, which is, where do we go from here, right? So this election is over. We've had this new election season, and we need to think about how we're going to move forward, because even though it sort of feels like something has happened, I think deep down, in a way, we all kind of know maybe not all that much did happen and change. And rather than this being a night about talking about a new course of action, it's more a night about talking about getting back to work. So these elections, I feel like, come along and they're like weird punctuations in this sort of larger conversation that we've all been having and can and should be having. And they're loud punctuations and they're disruptive punctuations. So every 4 years, and even 2 years to some extent, but I think it really exists most dramatically at the presidential level, for upwards of a year, at least 6 or 9 months, the election sort of dominates our conversation, and we stop talking about a lot of things. And, you know, we start talking about national politics and we start talking about policy and positions. But more insidiously, there's an implication that comes in every few years that implies that the solution to the world's problems is going to be solved by who's in government. And not only is this obviously not the way that most of us discuss politics when, at least most of us that consider ourselves to be radical to some extent, it's not the way that we talk about politics in non-election season. And it's more so, it sort of builds this tacit acceptance and this even tacit empowerment of the state as the solution. So every time we sort of stop and make the national elections the sort of forefront and the totality of our conversation during the election season, we build the state. We build the state stronger. And conversely, by erasing and making invisible all of this sort of non-state level action that's taking place, and that has been taking place in the years preceding and even during the elections, we disempower. At the very least, we ignore the potential power of non-state level action. And this is, you know, one of the themes of tonight that we haven't talked about much, is this idea of the unpeople. And I feel like this is a layer of unpeopling, right? It's the silences of things that are expendable when it comes down to political discussion. Replaced by this reification that the state is the most powerful and important thing that we can imagine. And in fact, I sort of envision this much like a ritual that's like the opposite of Carnival, right? So much of the social purpose of the Carnival ritual is that there's this sort of bubbling over that Carnival fulfills, right? So you have a somewhat oppressive society, or you have oppressive systems in society, but here and there you are, or sort of annually, you have this moment in time where you can let the steam out so that the whole pot doesn't blow over, right? And I feel like the election cycle in the United States is almost the reverse of that. So we have this sort of like, okay, quiet approval and quiet acceptance of grassroots organizing, but every 4 years we're going to clamp down and remind you, just in case you forgot or just in case you get too excited, that really the state is the solution to the world's problems, and it's really just about who's in government, right? It's not about you folks out in the street. So it's kind of this sick, twisted ritual that is, instead of I don't know how to take this. Anyone that has heard me speak knows I can't finish my metaphors, but it's sort of the opposite of letting the steam out, right? It's not letting steam in, but do something with that metaphor. the effect of this is that there's a shrinkage of the acceptable discourse that takes place during the election season, and a lot of it is guided by fear. And we all take part in this. So this sense is that we don't want to empower the right? So we have the lesser of two evils. We don't want to, this isn't the time to be too critical, right? I've heard myself saying things like this. And really, we all sort of swallow and go along with lines of argument that we would never, ever say if it were not an election season. So we go through this, and we set aside important conversations, and we're silent, and we hold our tongue because we don't want the worst of the two evils to be in power. So yes, we could be critical, but we'll wait for that. And we line up, literally and metaphorically, and we vote. And I think, for the record, that we should vote. I'm not an abstenter, and I think that there's a delusion of election season that sets in that maybe this will be the election, that we will actually move this to some sort of radical discussion or even progressive discussion. But, I think my biggest argument for voting is that, we're part of the elections in the United States have consequences for the entire population of the planet. And we are really, as the tiny portion of the world's population that has any degree of voice in these elections, we do have a certain sort of global social obligation to show up and fill out the bubble. And it's really the least that we can do. And I think I'm stealing this line actually from Noam Chomsky, that voting is really the least we can do. And so we all know deep down that very little of the change that we need is going to happen by voting. And the change that we need, to sort of state it baldly, is going to happen through mass mobilization, it's going to happen through building communities, and it's going to happen through direct action. It's not going to happen through electoral politics. After we have mass mobilization, building of communities, and direct action, then perhaps electoral politics might change. So the answer to the question of where do we go from here in the post-election is the answer that we know already, and it's the same answer that would have been in place no matter who won the election. The answer is that we get back to work. We get back to building a movement that's rooted in radical politics and not political talking points, a movement that's rooted in international solidarity and action and not national interests. And the reason that I say that is that one of the biggest casualties of the election sort of shrinkage of discourse is the global dimension of the mobilizations for change. And Dr. Prashad brought this up already, that as everyone saw during the presidential debate on foreign policy, this was really just a conversation on the nuances of how and when to invade other countries. And really, this sort of fairy tale myth of the United States as a purveyor of democracy across the world. And there was even this completely open acknowledgement that the underlying motivation for anything is really still just the U.S. interests. There was literally no discussion of ways that the candidates might work to address issues of social justice globally. There was the idea that I would even bring the absurdity that a presidential candidate would talk about global social justice, I think, belies the fact that this is so removed from the conversation we don't even expect to hear it anymore. There was nothing about how they would work to support the right to water, to clean food, the right to move freely from one place to another, the right to control the resources in one's communities, the right to medication that is currently being blocked by U.S. corporate patents. And we could go on, issues that the United States is intimately involved in, issues that the United States government is intimately involved in, but that aren't considered acceptable points of political discourse in a presidential election. And the point is that even in the one conversation of the election season that's supposed to be about the international role of the United States, all we were really hearing about was national interest and none of the consequences. And I think the same was the case with the economy. So everything was about the American middle class this year, right? And getting American consumers to go out and spend more, and how to get American consumers jobs so they can have more, so they can spend more, so they can buy more. And American consumption was made into a measure of national success. And in this sort of shrunk discussion, there's no conversation about what rabid consumerism means to the rest of the world. one time, I just want to hear in an election season a politician say, well, that maybe if we don't want to have sweatshop shirts, that we could just pay more for our shirts. And of course, we would never hear that, right? This isn't electoral level politics. This is grassroots politics. Well, these are the same issues. And I use as a point of example on this issue of shirts. At the height of the election season in September and October, when we had international media covering every sneeze that each of these candidates made, there were two massive fires on the outskirts of Dhaka in Bangladesh. And these massive fires ravaged the slums where thousands and thousands of garment workers that work producing clothing for American corporations lived. And there was a remarkable, by which I mean not remarkable at all, absence of the entire event in the news media and in the political campaigns. And this is a pretty major event. The reason that, not just because it's an area of my interest, the reason that it was striking to me that it wasn't covered was because it revealed a couple of sort of disturbing aspects. Okay, so I've got to wrap it up. So the first thing that I think the sort of invisibility of the fires in Bangladesh revealed was that there's a couple of unpeople invisibility functions taking place. First of all, these are poor garment workers in Bangladesh, right? Their inconsequentiality and their expendability was already established long ago, and we can measure that in the control of and measure of their working conditions. Second, there's no sexy revolution taking place in Bangladesh, right? Most people are scrambling around trying to make sure that they know where we're even talking about when you bring up Bangladesh. There's certainly no spring taking place, so there's no political capital whatsoever for a politician to talk about this. And I think this really gets at the core of what an election and what the sort of level of discourse gets at, is that it's not about the topic, it's not about the content, it's about the popularity, right? It's about what people know, and it's about what's sexy. So I had other examples of how this invisibility was important, but I'm going to cut it short because I'm going to end with some rabble-rousing. So I think where we go from here is that, yes, we can look at the silences that were in the media. We can look at the silences that were in the campaign. But I would encourage everyone, and I include myself in this, to also look at our own silences, right? So how did we participate in this invisibility? How did we change our rhetoric during the elections? How did we lose focus? How did we stop working? I think that in the spirit of looking towards the positive and toward the active, a really great example for us to look at right now is building off the groundwork of the pre-election season that Occupy was laid, and looking at the Hurricane Sandy relief effort that's really being facilitated by the Occupy movement. And the reason, And the reason that this is so critical for us to see and acknowledge and point out and think about is that this is really the convergence, or this is a really prime example of solidarity model working, right? So you have local direct action. You have people on the ground and local asking, not telling, asking, what do you need? And then communicating that message to a larger, wider audience. And then the larger, wider audience is able to communicate and to send back the resources that fulfill and provide the answer or the supplies in response to this question of what do you need? And so I think we can commit ourselves with that example, and there's many others that, again, I'm having to cut. We can commit ourselves here and now to getting back to work, building a radical mass movement that is based on the principles of what we have in common, that is based on asking each other what we need and not being told what we need, and looking at common grievances but also common desires. What are we working for together? And commit ourselves to learn and to listen and to remember the invisibilities that we forgot about during the elections campaign, and to remember the silences that we've gotten out of the habit, or the silences that we've gotten into the habit of in. So, well, I'll end my rabble-rousing with just that that the elections are done. It's this punctuation, this interruption is over, and it's time for us to get back to work, right? It's time for us to organize. And I'll leave it at that.
what hasn't been addressed in the past 4 years? The answer is pretty simple, just about anything that matters. And what do we do about it? Exactly what all you know. And what?
Okay. Yeah. Can we get the mics up?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're okay.
All right. Is this okay?
I think
What?
they're going to turn up the mic, but also just speak right into it.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, what I said was if we ask what hasn't been seriously addressed in the past 4 years, the answer is very short, almost anything that matters. What do we do about it? What you all know. There are no magic tricks. It takes hard work, dedication, reaching out to others, trying to, in the case of the Occupy movement, which in my view was very successful and has plenty of potential, what has to be done, and the same is true of other activist movements, is to reach out to the general population. We can talk about the 99% and say, yeah, we're concerned with your problems and your needs, but they have to believe that. And if they don't believe it, it doesn't matter if we believe it. And we're far from that. It's hard. All of the things that were mentioned, there's been an element of success in reaching out to the general population, but it's nowhere near enough. You mentioned global warming. It's probably the most serious issue that the United States and the world faces. It could lead to, it's an issue that involves species survival, decent species survival, and it's not remote. I don't know. And the United States, unfortunately, is in the lead in making it worse. And the way it's discussed, the discourse about it, shows you that. So some of you may have seen, for example, the front page story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about the ending of the summer melting of the Arctic ice. And it was a pretty alarmist story. It was an interesting one that showed what our problem is. The first half of the story, front page story, was pointing out that the Arctic ice melting was way beyond what even the most dire forecasts were of the sophisticated computer models, and talking about the dangers of this. I won't run through it, but you know them. Then the second half of the article was euphoric. It's a terrific opportunity. It opens the way to more mining, more extraction of fossil fuels. In other words, it opens up the way to accelerate the process of suicide, species suicide. And that passed, I looked for a while, it passed without comment. And that's true of the presidential debates as well. In fact, it's kind of striking that in 2008, both parties had some gesture towards global warming. The Republicans conceded that there was something going on. The Democrats had some minor programs about it. That's done. In 2012, the Republicans didn't mention it. When Romney was asked, he said, well, nothing's known about it. We just need more research. The Democrats had a few weak words, and then both candidates and both parties dedicated themselves with, fervently to what they call energy independence. There's nothing to do with energy independence, but what it means is maximizing the disasters that are going on. We have to extract all the fossil fuels we can as quickly as possible, and that's the best thing we have to do. Well, that's both parties. That's virtually the entire discussion. If you turn to domestic issues, it's the same. So if you look at people have opinions, and they're very well studied. And it's interesting to look at them. So on domestic issues, the public overwhelmingly regards joblessness as the most serious issue. But the banks don't. They regard the deficit as the most serious issue. So therefore, the entire discussion is about the deficit. There's a couple of words on jobs here and there, meaningless ones. When you look at what people think about the deficit, it's pretty clear. Overwhelmingly, the population thinks the way to deal with the deficit is higher taxes on the rich, cutting back the military budget, which is incredibly, as you all know, it's about the same as the rest of the world combined, and making sure you preserve the benefits. You take a look at the two parties, basically the opposite. Media coverage, pretty much the opposite. And if you look more closely, it's quite striking. So there was a very interesting poll of Southern whites, you know, the red states. It's the white working class. Southern whites was restricted to taxes. And like the rest of the country, large majority favor higher taxes on the rich. The same large majority favored Romney's tax plan. Now, there's only two possible explanations for this, neither of them very pretty. One of them is that our educational system and media system is so grotesque that people just don't know something of extreme importance to them. The other possibility is that the racism is so deep that if Obama suggested something, you got to be against it. And therefore, even we'll support Romney's tax plan, even if it's the opposite of what we want. I don't see any other possible explanation. All of this, repeat what I said before, I think indicates paths that have to be very seriously addressed. You cannot write off the white working class. You can't say, well, they're all Republicans, the heck with them. Those people have to be reached. You can't write off the Tea Party. If you take a look at people who call themselves Tea Party supporters, you know, get the government off our back, that kind of thing, they've been studied too. Turns out that these people think there ought to be more spending on education, more spending on health. They're wrong about how it should be done, but that's again our failure to educate. But more spending, more spending on help for poor people who need help, like dependent women, women with dependent children. More spending. On the other hand, less spending for welfare. Why? Because welfare has been very effectively demonized, originally by Ronald Reagan, who, you recall, he managed to instill the conception that welfare is rich black women being driven in their limousines to steal your money. So, of course, we don't want that. The same is true on international affairs. So a large majority of the public thinks the UN ought to take the lead in international affairs, and the U.S. ought to follow the will of the majority, if we don't like it. It's unmentionable in polite circles, in the media or anywhere else. Actually, a majority think that the United States ought to give up the veto at the Security Council and just follow others. If you look at questions like, say, foreign aid, it's again very striking. A large majority think we have to cut back on foreign aid because we're giving away everything to the undeserving poor. The next question, what do you think foreign aid ought to be? The number that people pick is much higher than it actually is. Well, I think that shows, all of this shows there are kind of decent sentiments out there, but they've got to be organized and mobilized, and we can easily continue.
Well, to build on that, I'll make 2 points. The first one is that there's a really, I think, important barrier that has to be overcome. And that is the barrier that I think we have to also come to terms with, which is that to live in the United States, which was at the center of the 20th century's empire, was to benefit from that empire. And it enabled people in the so-called golden age of capitalism to have advantages on the backs of the rest of the planet. So now when people say our children will not be able to have the life that we had, you know, this apparently is a major test of the decline of America. People say this routinely, your children will not be able to have your life. that is said actually in a way as if it's a bad thing. And in fact, from my perspective, that's not a bad thing at all. It's a good thing that it reveals that the United States, which has a fraction of the world's population and yet consumes 25% of the energy, the United States, which is unable to actually buy the amount of products that its population buys, but has to borrow from the Gulf states and China and other countries, and then provide credit cards to a population whose real wages haven't increased substantially since 1973, so that the American dream is sustained by a kind of debt-fueled consumerism, that debt purchased by countries overseas through imperial force, essentially. The power of, aerial bombarding anybody around the world, the Gulf states believing that the United States is their policeman as well, etc. So they are willing to keep their super profits in dollars. They're willing to park them in the United States. Therefore, the banks are able to have liquidity to give out credit cards, to give out no money down payment for housing, etc. Those perquisites of imperialism are coming to an end. And it's going to be a major cultural battle to convince people that it's actually a good thing that the next generation will not live high off the hog of the planet. So that, I think, is going to be a major, major cultural and political battle to ensure that that is not seen as something bad, but something good. And how to turn that around is going to be very complicated. It speaks directly to questions of sustainability, to, carbon-fueled madness, etc. It speaks directly to that. The second thing, speaking not as an activist, in terms of base building, but as somebody who works mainly as an intellectual, I think it's extremely important for us to work very hard in producing a narrative, a story, a clear conception of how the political establishment in the United States is simply not serious. And again, just developing what Noam spoke about, you spoke about it from the standpoint of climate change. Take the question of Iran. Every mainstream newspaper in the United States has run a story at some point in the last 2 or 3 years, often on page 6 or 7. They run these stories which say very cavalierly in the 12th or 13th paragraph, they'll say that the various intelligence agencies, and when they say various, they mean only 3 that are important to them, the US intelligence agencies, the Israelis, and the agencies associated with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. These 3 intelligence agencies are all in agreement. And this have been stories over the last 18 months at least. These agencies are all in agreement that Iran has no present desire or has no weapons program. There is no interest in weaponization. All the mainstream media have reported this. The New York Times, the Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal ran a story where deep in the story they said none of the agencies that matter to them believe that Iran has a nuclear weapons policy. And yet, the political establishment has built this so-called case that Iran must be stopped, and you saw the roadrunner standing there with his little sign at the UN saying that the red line cannot be crossed. Nonsense like that. They are not serious people. These are duplicitous people. They are dangerous people. And yet, the bulk of the population, including many of us, many of us take him seriously. These are duplicitous people. They are not serious. They are running the planet into a very dangerous direction. Thank God for WikiLeaks. If you go back and look at the WikiLeaks corpus of the State Department cables, and just look at the climate change cables, at the same time as the Obama administration was so-called trumpeting a new climate change policy, breaking away from Bush, right? Obama goes in this magnificent way and arrives in Copenhagen to broker the deal. At the same time as in public they play this, public relations exercise. Behind the scene, State Department officials are strong-arming countries, going to Bolivia, going to Ecuador, going to Equatorial Guinea, and telling countries that you better vote against a global entente, otherwise we'll cut off your aid. And despite the fact that Evo Morales has decided quite stupidly to build a road right through a protected forest, Morales told the State Department official to get the hell out of his office. And thank God for WikiLeaks that we can read about it. And yet, we, all of us, have faith in this political establishment. We think it's serious. These are not serious people. We need to be revealing to our neighbors, to our friends, to our communities, that the political establishment is full of shit. And we just don't do that. We take them seriously. We treat them as if they are people that we have to engage with, that we have to debate with on a rational terrain. They don't behave rationally. They are serial arm twisters. When are we going to figure that out?
A lot of microphones in front of me, and I'm not really sure which. Is this audible? I think it seems that way. Well, I can't follow that. But what I can add.
That I said the word shit?
Exactly. Exactly. But I think what I can add and what it strikes is it's sort of building off of this idea that the political establishment is not serious, and that that can be it can be incredibly frustrating and angering as it is, but it's also incredibly empowering, right? This isn't some sort of monolithic power that or an all-knowing power that can't be defeated. They're in fact kind of an easy target for critique in a lot of ways. And I think that one of the things that maybe needs to be said and that we can focus on as activists is that I actually think we're usually a lot harder on ourselves than we are on any of the political establishment. And I feel like I've had much more harsh and critical conversations among leftists in the age-old tradition of the left in the world about sort of differences among ourselves and nuances in our ideological positions than we're even applying to those that I don't like the term, but that aren't even on our team, right? So here we are debating over really the definitions of the socialist tradition or the anarchist tradition, and we're directing all of these bombs at each other, and we're directing all of these criticisms at each other for the languages that we're using and the ideologues that we're worshiping versus the other ideologues that he's worshiping. And meanwhile, this carnival is taking place in power that we're not actually addressing any of this to, because we're so distracted by all of this infighting among ourselves. And there's this idea that we have to resolve all of our personal grievances and differences first before we can take on the foes. And I would just like to reverse that course and say, okay, you know what, we don't agree on everything yet. I don't agree on everything with everyone, but there are lots of things that we do agree on, and those things are usually that what's happening at the level of state power is absurd. And so maybe we can just sort of use this moment, now that the election is over, to sort of lighten up on each other and look for common goals. So there's my tag on for that.
A simple question. By a show of hands, how many people voted this week? Okay, all right. One thing I want to put out and I want to assert is, honestly, I think we vote every day, right? Whether you're making that choice to get something at McDonald's, or you're going down the street to the mom and pop shop, or the mom and mom shop, or the pop and pop shop, right, to support your local community business, you know? Whether you choose to wear Gucci or Fendi, or, you have your cousin from Liberia make you a vest. We're voting every day, and money is one way that we do vote. And I would actually say that every single person in here voted today because you chose and you decided to place your money here so we can get some information, we can do some movement building, as well as support an organization known as E5. So without further ado, the next person I have coming up is a former union organizer.